I'm here with the iron. It's just a standard iron, nothing fancy. I have our trusty scrap bit back. Before you iron anything, check how hot you need your iron. You don't always need it scorching hot. These have lycra and man-made fabrics in them. So whereas a 100% cotton, you could use a really hot iron. On these, you shouldn't, because you can damage the stretchy bit of it in it. So what you need to do is, I've got my iron on 2. I'm sure I'll need it a little bit hotter than that, but I'm just going to use it on my scrap piece, because should I burn my scrap piece, it doesn't matter. It does matter if I burn the garment I'm making. Actually, 2's quite hot for that. And you can see it's pressed it really quite nicely. Those wavy bits are almost gone. Okay, so what happens when you press it, when you're stitching, it stretches the fabric slightly, it stretches the thread, everything stretches and moves a little bit, and when you press, that brings it back together. There's still a little bumpy on this side, and I'm going to press it again on that side too. So you press both sides of your stitching, and you will see, like magic, it makes it lovely and flat and pulls it all back to where it should live. Now, I'm not going to go any hotter than that. That's the number 2. I'm quite happy with that. I might even turn it down a little bit, because that is quite warm. You can use steam if you want. I don't use steam in my iron because I live in a hard water, chalk area, lime area, whatever it is, and it bungs up my iron. So you would go through an iron in a year. So I don't ever use water in my iron, not even the bottled water, because it still has it in. So I don't use it. If I want steam, I will either spray this with water to create steam, or I will use a pressing cloth. So anyway, I'm happy with that. So I'm going to press my 4 seams on here, on both sides. I'm going to lay them flat. Pressing is so underrated. You really need to get into the habit of pressing. We're not ironing, we're pressing. And what that is you're putting down your stitched piece, you're taking your iron, you're just running it along to flatten out any bumps in it, and then you're going to hold it just for a second or 2 in place. That's pressing. So we're pressing this, not ironing it. I'm going to do it on all of the seams on both sides. Now this, I'm just going to show you before I do this one. It's quite wrinkly on both sides. So I'm going to press this orange side. So just run it along, make sure everything's flat under the iron, and I'm just going to press it just a second or 2. And I sort of, I brush away with the iron, away from the seam. So that just pushes a flat on. So I'm just going to show you this. You can see how much, even on this side, there's less creases, but there are still a few left. I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to press this seam, make sure there's no creases in it, and then I'm pressing it, sliding the iron away from it, and you can see this is a beautiful flat seam now. Okay, so all of your seams, you need to do that on. Not going to make you watch, but there we go. Now, while I'm here, we're going to press this seam on the raglan. Well, I'm going to press the seam. I'm going to do a little bit of top stitching on it, actually, in a moment. And I'm going to do it now. I'm going to press it towards the main body. And when I top stitch, I'm going to top stitch on the pattern. So I've just laid that out. And I'm just going to take my iron and I'm pushing that underneath. The seam allowance is going towards the pattern, and I'm pushing the seam over gently. Can you see I'm nudging it over? That will give me a lovely flat surface to do my stitching on. Okay, I'm going to do that on all 4 of them. Okay, so I've moved over to the sewing machine, and I'll just show you the seams that we've got. I've trimmed this seam down. These are the raglan seams. So I've trimmed this seam down. If you like to trim your seams down, you can. It does make it a little harder when you're top stitching. I've left the other seams not trimmed. I prefer personally not to trim them. If they were ridiculously wide, I probably would, but I don't. The fabric doesn't fray. I mean, you could pink them, but there's no need to because the fabric doesn't fray. So I'm leaving my seams like this. And I'm going to do some top stitching, as I said I would. Now, I was hoping to top stitch using the twin needle, but I've used my scrap pieces to check, and today my machine is not wanting to sew using a twin needle on this fabric. It really didn't like it, and I'm not going to risk it. I'd rather have a finished garment with a single row of top stitching. So I'm using my foot. I can't show you on the machine, but I'm using my foot as a guide again. I've got a zigzag foot on, so you can see the little gap, about 1/4 inch gap there, where the needle goes up and down in the foot. So I'm going to use the edge of the pattern. I'm going to run it against the edge of this hole. Depending on which side I do, depends on which side it runs to, but I'm going to guide it through the edge of that hole. That's going to be my guide. Okay, so I'll put that away. I'm all sorted for straight stitching, and I'm hoping it's going to play. So I'm using about a 3 on this stitch. You need to keep tucking under to make sure that seam stays under and it runs nicely along where I'm guiding it. You can see I'm doing this nice and slowly. Try and get it even. Although it's gone a little off there. I have to say, it doesn't have to be perfect, ladies, because remember, it's for a 2-year-old. He's not going to be bothered about it at all. Now, I've stitched this one from the sleeve to the neck. I could feel while I've been stitching, it hasn't really liked stitching it that way. And this does make a difference. It's about the stretch on the fabric, really. Hopefully you can see. Just let me take that through. You can see it's top stitched. I think you can anyway. Now you can also see it's made it a little curvy. I'm not happy with that. So the next one, I'm going to stitch from the top down. So from the neckline down to the sleeve. This does quite often make a difference. I'm going to use a bigger stitch, a longer stitch. So I've put it on the full length stitch for my machine, and we'll see what happens here. So off I go again. And this is all trial and error. There we go. I'm not having... Yeah, I think that's taking much better actually. Yeah, it is a lot better. And just make sure we pull that out and curve it around the corner. There we go. Okay, so let's have a look at this one. If I was doing these to sell, by now I'd have made that many. I'd have got this perfect every time. There we go. It's you can see it's stitched much nicer, less wrinkly. We've only got a few wrinkles. They'll pull out when we iron this. This is it on the back. Okay, so you can still trim this away when you've done the top stitching. If you want, you can still trim this down. I'm not going to. So I'll be back in a minute when I've just stitched the rest. Right, I've pressed these top stitch seams on both sides, and they're all laying flat apart from the first one I did, which is still a little bit wrinkly. And if you remember, I wasn't happy with that. Still not happy with it, but I'm not going to unpick it. Unfortunately, it's on the front. I wish it wasn't, but it is. But nobody will notice. I can assure you, I've been sewing that long that nobody really looks unless you tell them and you go, well, there was a problem with it. Then they see it, but otherwise they won't. So I'm going to turn this inside out now because we're going to do the side seams. Okay. And I'm going to pin at the cuffs, where the cuffs would be, but we're hemming these, they're not going to have cuffs on. And I'm going to pop a pin down at the hem of the t-shirt bottom. And then I'm going to come up to the armhole where the seams meet here. Okay. And because we've top stitched them, we can't make them sit nicely and nestle in each other. They have to be on top of each other. So you just have to remember this when you're stitching this bit, that it is a bit thicker as you take your machine over it, and try not to stretch it as you pull it over. So I've actually matched my seams, and then about an inch or a couple of centimeters away from the armpit, I put a pin in. So I have 3 pins in around the armpit, one at the bottom, one at the top. As I've said, I'm a bit naughty because I've sewn for so many years, that really you should pin those seams together. And if you are a beginner and you're not that confident, put more pins in, or clips if you're using clips, just so it holds those edges together for you. Okay, I don't sew for business. I don't make money out of this. I sew for pleasure, and that means I can afford to not be perfect. When I was younger and I first was dressmaking, I did a lot of dressmaking for myself, my family, and for other people. I was actually a dressmaker for a few months. Well, a bit longer than that, actually. And whenever I made anything with a mistake in for myself, I could always spot it. It stood out like a sore thumb. It's a little bit, when you make a mistake and you're decorating your house, you'll always see that mistake. It took a lot of years for me to realise nobody else sees that mistake that you've made unless you point to it. My family were the best dressed in the district because I wouldn't wear the clothes I made, because I knew there was a little, the buttonhole wasn't quite right, or I'd made a mistake there. They didn't care. They couldn't see it. Nobody else could see it. So don't be overly judgmental on your work. The stuff you buy in the shops is a lot worse, I can assure you. And I bet you never notice either. You don't go and look at all the seams when you're in the shops, do you? No, you don't. So we're ready for sewing. It's pinned on both sides. I'm going to sew both sides. So I'm going to pop over to the sewing machine. I'm going to use the zigzag like I did on the other seams. And I'm probably going to sew from the arm down to the bottom and hope that it likes it that way. It should be fine. I'll see you in a bit.